You can start good management of your flight before you ever take off. You can do that by going through the PAVE checklist to pave your way to a safe flight. What this lets you do is think in advance about those things that might cause problems for a flight. We call these things risk factors. Now, here are the 4 major categories of risk factors that you need to think about before you leave on a flight. And they are the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and external pressures, spelling PAVE. The first, and by far the most important risk factor, is the pilot. We've already determined that you are the #1 risk factor in the flight. So before you go on a flight, ask yourself, how do I feel today? If, for instance, it's the day for your first solo and you just don't feel up to snuff, mention it to your instructor. There will always be plenty of time to solo, and it's just not wise to do it on a day on which you're not feeling good. Also ask yourself, did I get plenty of sleep? Now, the amount of sleep that people need is very individual. Personally, I don't feel good if I don't have at least 8 hours of sleep. On the other hand, on some days, I can go flying and be safe if I only have 6 hours. But I certainly wouldn't be safe if I only had 2 hours of sleep the night before. So think about how much sleep you need. Come up with a number in your mind, and if you haven't had that number, then don't go flying. Also think about food and water. These things are highly variable too. I know from experience that some people do a lot better than others without food. Personally, if I go 6 or 7 hours without having something to eat, I know that I'm going to feel pretty crummy. On the other hand, some people say they get sleepy when they eat and they don't like to eat before they fly. Personally, I wouldn't want to take off for a solo flight without having eaten something within the last 2 to 3 hours. So think about how recently you feel that you need to have eaten before you go flying. Another thing to think about is, what kind of day have you had? If it's been an extremely difficult day, you might not want to solo today. Put it off to another day when you've had more chance to relax. Also, are you under any unusual stress in your life overall? Now, obviously, it depends what the stressful event was, but let's assume you've just had a knockdown, drag-out argument with your spouse. Would you want to go on your first solo flight in the next hour? It probably wouldn't be a wise idea. How long would you want to wait? Well, I'd say at least 24 hours, one day, maybe even a little longer if your spouse just told you they wanted a divorce. So for stressful events, it depends, of course, how stressful and what it is, but think about the stress in your life right now and consider how it might affect the safety of your solo flight. Also consider the effects of alcohol. Now, the FAA's rule is 8 hours from bottle to throttle. Many people think that 24 hours is better. Some pilots settle on 12 hours. And of course, it depends on how much you've had to drink. If you had a whole lot to drink the night before, it might take longer than 12 hours or even 24 hours to recover. In fact, a hangover can cause you as much of a problem as being intoxicated. So think about it and make sure that you are free from the effects of alcohol, even if it's been more than 12 or 24 hours. Also, think about illness. If you've had a bad case of the flu, you probably wouldn't want to fly for 4 or 5 days. But if it's a mild cold, maybe you could fly within 2 days. In any event, I wouldn't want to go out on my first solo if I had a bad cold. By the same token, you want to think about drugs and medications. Of course, it's important to know what kind of drugs and medications we're talking about. But in this case, I'm really thinking about cold medications. Again, it depends on what you're taking. But if you know that you are negatively affected by a cold medication, you might want to tell the instructor that you don't want to do your first solo while you've been taking that medication. And finally, ask yourself, Am I prepared for this flight? Do I have the proper charts, equipment, knowledge, and planning I need for the flight that I'm about to undertake? The next category in our risk factors checklist is the aircraft. Is this aircraft one that you're familiar with? Let's assume it comes your day to solo, and when you arrive at the airport, your instructor says, "We have a new airplane for you." Would you really want to make your first solo in an airplane that you've never been in before? Maybe if the airplanes were absolutely identical, it would be okay. But even the same make and model of airplane can have very important differences. Think about it. Do you know how to operate the audio panel? Do you know how to operate all the nav and comm radios? And is there anything else different from the airplane you've been flying? While you're thinking about the aircraft, one important thing to think about is aircraft performance, because any aircraft will perform differently when it only has one occupant in it. So no matter what airplane you fly, you can expect it to accelerate faster, take off sooner, and climb faster. And it's likely to float longer on landing too. The next risk factor category to think about is the environment. If you're about to go on your first solo flight, think about the wind and the weather. Are you comfortable with these wind and weather conditions? Make your own assessment, regardless of whether your instructor feels that these are okay for you. And think about the airport traffic conditions. Is this a particularly busy time of day? Do you feel comfortable dealing with this airport traffic for your first solo? Now let's talk about one of the most frequently overlooked risk factors, and that's external pressure. Many pilots get so eager for their first solo that without realizing it, they allow themselves to pile a lot of pressure on themselves. To make sure you avoid doing this, think about these items. First of all, did I leave plenty of time for my flight? The last thing you want to do is feel you have to rush through an important event like your first solo. Give yourself enough time to be relaxed and really enjoy it. If you're flying on a solo cross-country, have you made provisions for an overnight stay? Carry enough money or credit cards so that if you get out at another airport and have a weather problem or mechanical problem, you can comfortably spend the night. And carry a little RON or Remain Overnight kit with you on every flight. It should include anything you feel you can't do without overnight, such as a contact lens kit. And finally, take the biggest pressure of all off. Tell your family and friends not to come to the airport for your first solo. That way, you can feel free to make the decision that, no, today is just not the day for me. And you won't feel guilty about letting other people down. For your solo flights and any flights you take in an aircraft, think PAVE: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. When you're getting ready for a flight, use PAVE as a mental checklist to help spot the risk factors of a flight. Of course, everything may not apply on every trip, and no checklist can cover every situation. But you'll find that with practice, you'll get better at spotting the risk factors in a given situation. And the checklist will be especially helpful in spotting the subtle risk factors that are often the most dangerous, like the ones caused by external pressures. Using the checklist will help make sure you think through your most important pre-flight and in-flight decisions instead of leaving them to chance. One other thing. Pilots often say that usually no one thing causes an accident. It takes several things that finally add up to cause an accident. And if you can break that building chain, you can prevent the accident. Well, that's true. So here's what you should watch for. If you have an item that's marginal in a single risk factor category, that might not be so bad. But if you have items in more than one category, you could be headed for trouble and not even know it. We call the compounding effect from multiple categories of risk factors the cumulative effect. The cumulative effect is the insidious cause of most accidents. So here is a rule you should make. If you have marginal items in 2 or more risk factor categories, don't go. Make sure to think through your PAVE checklist before every flight, and you'll pave your way to a fun, comfortable, and stress-free experience.